Hey guys, tonight the journey leads beneath the folds of Rome's most iconic garment, where the reality of ancient Roman dress reveals itself to be far more complex, practical, and sometimes uncomfortable than the simple, draped elegance shown in statues and paintings. From the layers wrapped around citizens' bodies to the undergarments that provided modesty and protection, from the sweat-soaked practicalities of Mediterranean heat to the social meanings encoded in every fold and fabric choice. Roman clothing was a system of meanings, discomforts, and careful calculations that modern imaginations rarely grasp. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there's genuine interest in what unfolds here, and let everyone know in the comments where the viewing is happening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. When modern minds conjure ancient Rome, the toga appears as the quintessential Roman garment, draped elegantly over citizens as they debate philosophy in the Forum or watch games in the Colosseum. This vision carries some truth, certainly, but it represents only the outermost layer of a more complex reality. The toga, that semicircular expanse of wool requiring precise draping to achieve proper appearance, was never worn alone. Beneath its folds lay other garments, practical layers that made the toga wearable and that reveal much about Roman life, social hierarchy, and the daily physical experience of inhabiting an ancient body. The question of what Romans wore under their togas might seem trivial, the sort of detail that doesn't matter much compared to military campaigns, political intrigue, or philosophical achievements. Yet clothing was never merely functional in Rome. Every garment carried social meaning. What a person wore, how they wore it, and what fabrics and colours they chose, all communicated status, occupation, citizenship, and respectability. Understanding Roman dress reveals Roman values about the body, modesty, social hierarchy, and the relationship between appearance and identity. The sources for understanding Roman clothing are varied and uneven. Literary texts mention garments in passing, usually when something about dress was unusual or socially significant. Legal texts specify what garments certain people could or couldn't wear, revealing the regulatory framework surrounding dress. Artistic representations show clothing in sculptures, mosaics, and wall paintings, though these were often idealized rather than strictly realistic. Archaeological evidence provides actual textile fragments, though these survive poorly and primarily from unusual preservation contexts like Egyptian desert sites. The combination of sources allows reconstruction of basic facts about Roman dress, but many details remain uncertain or debated. The exact draping techniques for togas, the precise differences between garment types, the materials and construction methods, all these involve some degree of educated guesswork based on incomplete evidence. What follows represents current scholarly consensus, while acknowledging areas of uncertainty. Tonight's exploration begins not with the toga itself, but with the innermost layers, the garments closest to the skin that few ancient artists bothered depicting, because they were private and unremarkable. From there, the journey moves outward through the layers, examining the tunic that served as the primary garment for most Romans most of the time, then the toga itself and its complex social meanings, before considering women's dress, which followed entirely different patterns. The path continues through questions of fabric, colour, and social meaning, explores regional and seasonal variations, and concludes by examining how Roman dress changed across the centuries of Roman history. The goal isn't merely cataloguing garments, but understanding what it actually felt like to dress as a Roman, what physical sensations and practical difficulties the clothing created, and what the clothing choices revealed about the wearers and their society. Roman dress was simultaneously more complex and less comfortable than modern imaginings suggest, bound by social rules that made clothing choices fraught with meaning while the garments themselves posed practical challenges that wearers had to navigate daily. So settle in, perhaps with appreciation for modern elastic waistbands and climate control, and prepare to discover what ancient Romans really wore beneath their togas. The reality involves more layers, more sweat, more social anxiety about proper appearance, and more practical problem-solving than the elegant marble statues ever suggest. The foundation of Roman male dress, the garment closest to the skin and rarely discussed in polite company, was the sublegaculum, a loincloth that provided basic modesty and protection. This simple garment, essentially a strip of fabric wrapped around the hips and between the legs, was the Roman equivalent of modern underwear, serving similar functions while reflecting very different assumptions about the body and modesty. The subligaculum, also called by the diminutive subligarium, or the Greek-derived perizoma, consisted of a length of linen or wool fabric tied around the waist. The exact wrapping method is uncertain, as ancient sources didn't describe such basic procedures in detail, but archaeological evidence and artistic depictions of athletes and workers suggest several possibilities. The most likely configuration involved passing the fabric between the legs and tucking or tying it at the waist, creating a covering for the genitals while leaving the legs free for movement. The fabric was typically linen for those who could afford it, as linen was lighter, cooler, and more comfortable against skin than wool. The length and width of the cloth varied, with some sources suggesting a strip roughly 3 yards long and perhaps a foot wide, though these dimensions weren't standardised. The colour was usually undyed natural linen white or off-white, as this undergarment wasn't meant to be seen, and elaborate decoration would be pointless. Not all Roman men wore subligacula regularly. The garment was essential for certain activities and contexts, but might be omitted in others. Athletes competing in gymnasia and at games wore loincloths exclusively, exercising naked except for this minimal covering. The Greeks had competed entirely nude, considering the display of the body natural and appropriate, but Romans maintained somewhat greater modesty, requiring at least this minimal covering during athletic activity. Workers engaged in hot, physically demanding labour often worked wearing only subligacula, particularly in summer heat. Farm workers, construction labourers, dock workers, and others whose occupations involved heavy exertion found that stripping to this minimal clothing prevented overheating while maintaining legal modesty. The distinction between appearing in a loincloth while working and appearing thus in other contexts was important, with the former being acceptable necessity while the latter would be scandalous. Gladiators in the arena wore variations of the subligaculum as their only lower body covering, with added protective belts and leg wrappings depending on their fighting style. The exposure of gladiatorial bodies was part of the spectacle's appeal, displaying masculine physiques while maintaining minimal modesty through the loincloth. The gladiatorial subligaculum was often more elaborate than the ordinary version, with wider belts and sometimes decorative elements, transforming utilitarian underwear into part of the performance costume. Soldiers on campaign might sleep in their subligacula, using this minimal clothing for nighttime rest, while keeping other garments ready for sudden alarms. The military context required readiness, and the loincloth allowed quick dressing while providing basic modesty in the crowded conditions of military camps where privacy was limited. The question of whether men wore subligacula under their tunics in daily urban life is less clear. Some probably did, viewing the loincloth as providing an extra layer of protection and security. Others may have worn only the tunic, considering the loincloth unnecessary, when the longer tunic provided adequate coverage. Social class likely influenced these choices, with wealthy men perhaps more likely to wear multiple layers, including the loincloth, while poorer men might economise by omitting it when the tunic alone seemed sufficient. The material culture of subligacula is nearly absent from the archaeological record. These garments were simple, made from relatively inexpensive materials, and wore out through regular use and washing. When they became too threadbare for further use, they would be discarded or repurposed as rags rather than being preserved. The lack of material evidence makes reconstruction dependent on textual references and artistic depictions, both of which are limited for such a mundane and private garment. The existence and use of the subligaculum reflected Roman attitudes about the body and modesty that differed from both earlier Greek practices and later European Christian traditions. Romans didn't celebrate complete nudity the way Greeks had, considering total exposure of adult male genitals to be somewhat shameful, or at least inappropriate in most contexts. Yet they weren't as thoroughly covered as later medieval Europeans would be, finding the minimal coverage of the loincloth adequate for many purposes. The loincloth also served practical functions beyond modesty. It provided support and protection for male genitalia during physical activity, preventing injury and discomfort. It absorbed sweat and prevented chafing from outer garments. It created a barrier between body and the coarser fabrics of tunics, making clothing more comfortable. These practical benefits ensured that the subligaculum remained part of Roman dress throughout antiquity, despite its humble status. Women's equivalent undergarment was the subligar or strophium when worn as a lower body covering, though the terminology is confused in sources and the exact garments different from men's subligacula. Women's undergarments were even less discussed in sources than men's, as discussing women's clothing in detail was considered inappropriate for male authors who produced most surviving texts. The female undergarments served similar functions of modesty and support, but were designed for different bodies and worn under different outer garments. The athletic and theatrical contexts provided most opportunities for ancient sources to mention loincloths, as these were situations where the garments were visible. Actors in certain comic roles or acrobats performing in circuses wore loincloths as their primary costume, making them part of the theatrical spectacle. These performance contexts allowed authors to discuss subligacula without the embarrassment of addressing private undergarments directly, as the theatrical loincloth was public costume rather than intimate apparel. The colour and condition of one's loincloth when it was visible could communicate social information. Clean, well-maintained loincloths suggested decent standards of personal hygiene and sufficient resources to maintain clothing properly. Dirty or tattered loincloths indicated poverty or neglect. In contexts where loincloths were visible, such as at public baths where men undressed together, these judgments about cleanliness and respectability based on undergarment condition were probably common. The washing and maintenance of subligacula was part of regular household labour or, for those who could afford it, was handled by commercial laundries called philonicae. These establishments cleaned clothing using various techniques including treading in alkaline solutions, scrubbing and beating. The repeated washing gradually wore out the fabric, necessitating periodic replacement of loincloths as they became too thin or torn to serve their purpose. The production of subligacula was simple enough that many might be made at home by spinning thread, weaving the cloth, and cutting and hemming appropriate lengths. This home production meant that even poor families could usually manage to provide basic loincloths for family members without purchasing expensive manufactured garments. The simplicity reduced costs and made this essential undergarment accessible across social classes. Understanding the subligaculum as the foundation of Roman male dress provides the starting point for understanding the layers above it. This simple strip of fabric, wrapped around the hips and tucked between the legs, was the first thing a Roman man put on when dressing, and the last thing removed when undressing. Its presence under other garments was usually invisible and unremarked, but essential to the complete picture of how Romans actually clothed themselves. The subligaculum represents the most intimate layer of Roman dress, the garment that touched skin directly, and that dealt with the body's most private regions. Its very existence shows that Romans, despite sometimes being portrayed as sexually liberated and unconcerned with modesty, actually had clear concepts of appropriate bodily coverage, and invested in maintaining that modesty, even in the most basic undergarment layer. The loincloth was where Roman dress began, the foundation upon which all other garments were built. If the subligaculum was the foundation, the tunic was the true essential garment of Roman dress, the piece of clothing that most Romans wore most of the time, and that served as the primary covering for the body. The tunic, called tunica in Latin, was far more important and ubiquitous than the toga, despite the latter's fame as the characteristic Roman garment. Understanding the tunic reveals the reality of how most Romans dressed daily and what it felt like to inhabit a Roman body clothed in ancient fashion. The basic tunic was a simple garment in construction but variable in details. In its most basic form, it consisted of two rectangular pieces of woven fabric sewn together at the sides and across the shoulders, with openings left for the head and arms. The result was essentially a long shirt extending from shoulders to knees, or sometimes mid-calf, with short sleeves or no sleeves at all, depending on style and personal preference. The fabric was wool for most tunics, as wool was readily available throughout the Mediterranean world, relatively inexpensive when purchased in simple undyed forms, and provided adequate warmth in winter while being tolerable in summer. Linen tunics were cooler and more comfortable, but also more expensive, making them a mark of some wealth and sophistication. The very wealthy might own silk tunics, an extreme luxury given silk's expense and exotic origin. The construction method for tunics was straightforward, using techniques that made efficient use of fabric and required only basic weaving and sewing skills. The fabric was woven on looms to approximately the desired width and length, then cut and sewn to create the tunic shape. The simplicity meant that tunics could be produced domestically in households with modest weaving equipment, or purchased from commercial weavers and clothiers at reasonable prices. The fit of tunics was loose rather than tailored. The garment hung from the shoulders with the body fabric draping freely. The waist was defined by a belt or cord tied around the middle, with the tunic fabric blousing above the belt and hanging below it to the desired length. This belting was essential, as it prevented the tunic from hanging straight like a shapeless sack, while allowing adjustment of the length by pulling more fabric up over the belt when shorter length was desired. The length of tunics varied by social class, occupation and personal choice. The standard length for citizen men was roughly to the knees, providing adequate coverage while allowing free movement of the legs. Longer tunics extending toward the ankles were associated with women, priests and intellectuals, while shorter tunics were worn by workers and soldiers who needed maximum mobility. The length communicated social information, with inappropriately short or long tunics for one's station being noticed and potentially criticised. Sleeve length similarly varied and carried meaning. Sleeveless tunics were common and considered properly Roman, while tunics with longer sleeves were sometimes viewed as effeminate or foreign, particularly in earlier periods. By the late Empire, long-sleeved tunics had become more acceptable and even fashionable, but in the Republic and early Empire, a man in a long-sleeved tunic might be viewed with suspicion as adopting foreign habits. The association of long sleeves with non-Roman peoples made them markers of cultural identity. The colour of tunics ranged from the natural off-white or cream of undyed wool to various dyed colours. White or near white was most common and appropriate for citizens, suggesting cleanliness and respectability. Dark colours like brown, grey or black were worn by workers and the poor, as these shades didn't show dirt as readily and were produced using cheaper dyes. Brighter colours like red, yellow or green required more expensive dyes and indicated wealth and status. Decorative elements could elevate simple tunics into status symbols. The most distinctive decoration was the clavus, a vertical stripe or pair of stripes running from each shoulder down the front and back of the tunic. The width and colour of these stripes indicated rank and office. Senators wore tunics with a broad purple stripe, the latus clavus, while equestrians wore tunics with a narrow purple stripe, the angustus clavus. These stripes immediately identified the wearer's social position and were legally regulated, with unauthorised wearing of senatorial or equestrian stripes being punishable offences. The quality of fabric, fineness of weave and precision of sewing all varied by price point and communicated relative wealth. A wealthy man's tunic might be woven from extremely fine wool with a smooth, even texture and precisely executed seams. A poor man's tunic would be of coarser wool, with a rougher texture and perhaps less skilled construction. These differences were visible to observant eyes and contributed to the constant social evaluation that occurred in Roman public spaces. Multiple tunics were worn simultaneously in cold weather, creating layered insulation. A man might wear a simple undertunic close to the skin with a nicer outer tunic on top. Soldiers on winter campaign reportedly wore multiple tunics, sometimes 3 or 4, to cope with cold conditions in northern provinces. This layering was the primary method for adjusting clothing to temperature, as Romans lacked the buttoned or zippered closures that would allow easily adding or removing outer layers. The wearing of tunics without additional outer garments was completely acceptable, and indeed standard for most activities and most people. Only Roman citizens performing specific civic and ceremonial functions were required to wear togas, and even they wore only tunics for most of their daily activities. The tunic was appropriate for work, for relaxation at home, for most religious observances, and for social gatherings among friends. It was the default Roman garment. Women's tunics differed from men's primarily in length, extending typically to the ankles rather than the knees. The construction was otherwise similar, with the long tunic called a tunica interior, serving as an undergarment worn beneath the stola, a dress-like outer garment. Women might wear multiple tunic layers just as men did, with finer tunics over simpler ones. The full complexity of women's dress will be addressed later, but the tunic foundation was similar across genders. Children's tunics were simply smaller versions of adult styles, scaled down to fit young bodies. Children of wealthy families might have tunics with decorative elements or particularly fine fabrics, while poor children wore simple, often threadbare tunics that might be passed down through siblings until completely worn out. the clothing of children mirrored their families' economic circumstances, with no special provision made for childhood as a distinct life stage requiring different dress. The practical experience of wearing a woolen tunic in Mediterranean climate was mixed. In winter, particularly in northern provinces, the wool provided appreciated warmth, especially when multiple tunics were layered. In summer, particularly in places like Rome with hot, humid conditions, the wool tunic was considerably less comfortable. Wool doesn't breathe as well as linen or modern fabrics, and a wool tunic in Roman summer would become sweat-soaked and uncomfortable during the day's heat. The maintenance of tunics required regular washing, a task complicated by the lack of modern laundry technology. Household washing involved soaking, scrubbing, beating and rinsing, a labour-intensive process that gradually wore out fabric while hopefully removing dirt, sweat and odours. Commercial Phallonica used more aggressive techniques including treading garments in alkaline solutions, which cleaned more effectively but also damaged fabric more quickly. The choice between home washing and commercial cleaning involved balancing convenience, cost and garment preservation. The smell of worn tunics must have been noticeable, particularly in summer. A wool tunic worn all day in heat would absorb sweat, acquiring an odour that washing could only partially remove. Multiple wearings between washings, which was probably common to avoid the wear caused by frequent laundering, would allow odours to accumulate. The Roman nose was probably more tolerant of body odours than modern sensibilities, as the olfactory environment of ancient cities included many strong smells from various sources. The comfort of tunics varied significantly by quality. Fine woolen tunics woven from high-quality thread with smooth finishing would be reasonably comfortable against skin, particularly if worn over a linen subligaculum that protected against chafing. Coarse woolen tunics made from rough yarn would be scratchy and uncomfortable, irritating skin particularly where the fabric rubbed against body areas like armpits, neck and waist. The poor tolerated this discomfort as unavoidable, while the wealthy could invest in more comfortable clothing. The social psychology of the tunic centred on its role as both public and private garment. Unlike the toga, which was specifically public and formal, the tunic was appropriate for nearly all contexts. A man could wear his tunic at home, in the forum, at the baths, at social gatherings and while working. This versatility made the tunic the garment Romans actually lived in, the clothing that shaped their daily physical experience more than any other. The tunic's simplicity and practicality explain its dominance in Roman dress. It was relatively inexpensive to produce, easy to put on and take off, comfortable for a wide range of activities, and socially appropriate for most situations. Unlike the toga's complex draping and restrictive format, the tunic allowed freedom of movement while providing adequate coverage. It was, in short, a sensible garment well suited to its purpose. Understanding the tunic as the central garment of Roman dress corrects the common misapprehension that Romans wore togas routinely. The tunic was what Romans actually wore daily, the garment they lived and worked in, the clothing that covered their bodies during most of their lives. The toga was an occasional addition for specific formal purposes, but the tunic was constant. To understand Roman dress, one must first understand that Romans were a people who wore tunics, not a people who wore togas. The toga's fame has obscured the tunic's fundamental importance, but any accurate picture of Roman clothing must restore the tunic to its central position. The toga, Rome's most iconic garment, was simultaneously a symbol of Roman citizenship and an intensely impractical piece of clothing that most Romans avoided wearing whenever possible. Understanding the toga requires grasping both its symbolic importance and its practical difficulties, recognizing that Romans themselves had complicated relationships with this garment that defined their identity while making their lives more difficult. The toga was essentially a large semicircular expanse of woolen fabric, measuring approximately 15 to 18 feet along the straight edge and 6 to 7 feet at its deepest point. The exact dimensions varied, with some sources suggesting even larger togas in certain periods, but the key characteristic was that this was an enormous amount of fabric that had to be draped carefully on the body to achieve the proper appearance. The weight alone was considerable, with estimates suggesting a toga might weigh 10 to 20 pounds of wool, a substantial burden to carry on one's body throughout the day. The draping of a toga was complex enough that many Romans, particularly wealthier citizens, required assistance from slaves or servants to don the garment properly. The process began with positioning one end of the toga's straight edge at the left shoulder, allowing that end to drape down the back almost to the ground. The remainder of the fabric was then brought across the front of the body, under the right arm, and across the chest and left shoulder, creating multiple layers and folds that had to be carefully arranged to achieve the correct appearance. The specific draping technique varied across Roman history, with different periods favouring different arrangements of the folds. By the imperial period, the characteristic feature was the sinus, a deep fold or pouch created in the fabric across the chest, which could be used to carry small objects. Another important feature was the umbo, a mass of fabric folds falling from the left shoulder, which required particularly precise arrangement to achieve properly. Getting these elements right took time, skill, and patience. Once draped, the toga was precarious. The garment was not pinned or fastened in place, but relied entirely on careful arrangement and the friction of fabric and against the body to maintain its form. Moving too quickly, gesturing too broadly, or simply the gradual shifting of fabric throughout the day could all disturb the carefully arranged folds, requiring constant adjustment to maintain proper appearance. One hand was often occupied holding the toga in place, effectively disabling that hand for other purposes. The practical difficulties of wearing a toga were numerous and significant. The garment restricted movement, making rapid walking difficult and running essentially impossible. It impeded arm movement, particularly of the right arm, which was generally kept inside the toga's folds. It heated the body considerably through its weight and multiple layers, making it uncomfortable in Rome's hot climate. And it required constant attention to prevent disarrangement, turning a simple act like sitting down into a delicate operation, requiring care to prevent fabric from falling improperly. These practical problems were acknowledged by Romans themselves, who complained about togas regularly in literature and private correspondence. Martial, the epigrammatic poet, wrote multiple poems complaining about togas' discomfort and impracticality. Juvenal noted that many Romans avoided wearing togas except when absolutely required. The younger Pliny mentioned the relief of removing his toga after public duties and relaxing in a tunic. The evidence makes clear that Romans themselves found togas burdensome. Despite these difficulties, the toga retained its position as the formal garment of Roman citizenship throughout the Republic and much of the Empire. It was required for certain public occasions, appearing in law courts, attending the Senate, participating in certain religious ceremonies, and conducting official business in the forum. For these formal contexts, Roman citizens were expected to appear in togas, with failure to do so being remarked upon and potentially criticised as inappropriate. The toga's association with citizenship was so strong that Romans referred to themselves as the toga-wearing people, gens togata, distinguishing themselves from barbarians who wore trousers or other foreign garments. The toga was a visual marker of Roman identity, immediately identifying the wearer as a citizen with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. Foreigners and slaves were prohibited from wearing togas, making the garment both a privilege and a requirement of citizenship. Different types of togas existed for different purposes and statuses. The toga virilis, or toga pura, was the plain white or off-white toga worn by adult male citizens for ordinary formal occasions. The toga praetexta had a purple border and was worn by magistrates holding office and by freeborn boys before they came of age. The toga candida was an especially whitened version worn by candidates for office, from which the word candidate derives. The toga picta was elaborately decorated and worn by triumphing generals and later by emperors. The colour symbolism of togas was important. The standard citizen's toga was technically undyed wool in its natural colour, which ranged from cream to light grey depending on the wool's source and processing. This natural colour was referred to as white, though it wasn't the bright white of modern bleached fabrics. Elaborate whitening processes using chalk or other substances could brighten the colour, creating the toga candida, but this required expense and effort. The purple-bordered toga praetexta marked its wearer as holding special status. Dark togas were worn for mourning, with the toga pulla, dark toga, being appropriate for funerals and periods of grief. The colour shift from the normal light toga to dark mourning garb provided visual indication of the wearer's emotional state and social situation. The conspicuousness of this change ensured that a mourner's status was immediately apparent to others, allowing appropriate social responses. Women did not wear togas except in very specific circumstances. free respectable women wore the Stola and Palla, different garments that will be addressed later. The toga was explicitly a male citizen's garment, with female toga wearing being associated primarily with prostitutes and adulteresses, who were legally required or permitted to wear togas as markers of their disgraced status. This gender-specific association made the toga a symbol of male civic identity, as much as Roman identity generally. The cost of togas varied enormously by quality. A simple toga of plain, undyed wool might be affordable for ordinary citizens, though still representing a significant clothing investment. High-quality togas woven from fine wool with expert finishing and bleaching treatments were expensive enough that only the wealthy could afford multiple examples or frequent replacements. The finest togas, particularly those with purple borders or elaborate decoration, were extremely costly, representing considerable wealth. The maintenance of togas was challenging and expensive. The large size and white or light colour made cleaning difficult and necessary. Fulling processes could clean and restore togas, but also damaged the fabric gradually. The cost of commercial laundering for such large garments was substantial. Wealthier Romans might own multiple togas to rotate through use, allowing worn ones to be cleaned while wearing another, but poorer citizens might struggle to maintain even a single toga in acceptable condition. The life cycle of a toga followed a pattern. When new, the toga was relatively bright and clean, making the wearer look prosperous and respectable. With use and repeated wearing, the fabric would become soiled and dingy despite cleaning attempts. Eventually, a toga would become too worn and discoloured to present an acceptable appearance, at which point it might be relegated to home use, given to dependents, or repurposed into other items. The visible quality of one's toga communicated economic status and respectability. The physical experience of wearing a toga combined weight, heat, restriction, and constant anxiety about maintaining proper appearance. The weight pressed down on shoulders throughout the day, creating fatigue. The multiple layers of wool fabric trapped body heat, causing sweating and discomfort, particularly in summer. The restricted movement required constant attention to avoid disturbing the careful draping, and the awareness that one's appearance was being judged based on the toga's arrangement created psychological pressure to maintain perfect form. The assistance required for toga wearing created additional social dynamics. Wealthy men depended on slaves to drape their togas each morning, making the ritual of donning this symbol of free citizenship ironically dependent on enslaved labour. The quality of the slave's skill in toga draping affected the master's appearance, creating incentive to train servants specifically in this task. Some enslaved people apparently specialised in toga draping, developing expertise in this arcane skill. The gradual decline in toga wearing across the imperial period reflected these practical difficulties and Romans' increasing willingness to abandon impractical traditions. By late antiquity, togas were worn rarely even for occasions that had previously required them. Alternative garments like the paenula, a practical cloak, increasingly substituted for togas in daily life. The toga persisted for the most formal occasions but lost its position as standard formal wear for citizens. The replacement of togas by more practical garments represented significant cultural change, reflecting transformations in Roman identity and values. As the empire expanded and incorporated diverse populations, the specifically Roman character of the toga became less central. As comfort and practicality became more valued relative to traditional formality, the toga's impracticality counted more heavily against it. The garment that had defined Roman citizenship for centuries gradually became a relic maintained primarily for ceremonial purposes. Understanding the toga requires recognizing this gap between symbolic importance and practical reality. The toga meant something profound to Romans about their identity and status, yet the same Romans found the garment burdensome and avoided wearing it when possible. This contradiction between the values a symbol represents and the lived experience of engaging with that symbol reveals tensions in Roman culture between tradition and convenience, between collective identity and individual comfort, between maintaining appearances and living practically. The toga's fame in modern imagination results partly from its visual distinctiveness, and partly from its presence in formal contexts that ancient sources and artworks emphasized. But this fame obscures the reality that most Romans most of the time wore tunics, not togas, and that even when togas were worn, they were donned over those tunics rather than replacing them. The complete picture of Roman dress thus includes the sublegaculum as foundation, the tunic as essential garment, and the toga as occasional burdensome overlay worn primarily for its symbolic value, despite its practical deficiencies. Roman women's clothing followed entirely different patterns than men's, reflecting different social roles, expectations of modesty, and cultural meanings attached to female appearance. While men's dress centred on the tunic and toga, women's dress was built around different garments that covered the body more completely, and signified respectable femininity through both form and function. The foundation of women's dress was similar to men's, a tunica interior, an undertunic that served as the innermost garment worn over female undergarments. This tunic was typically linen rather than wool, lighter and more comfortable against skin. The length extended to the ankles rather than knees, providing the fuller coverage expected of respectable women. Multiple undert tunics might be worn in cold weather, creating layers of insulation similar to men's practice. Women's undergarments beneath the tunic included the strophium or mamillar, a breastband that provided support and modesty. This band of fabric wrapped around the chest under the breasts, creating a flattening effect that was apparently considered attractive in Roman aesthetic. The breastband served both practical support functions and shaped the body's appearance according to cultural beauty standards that favoured a less emphasised bust line than some modern tastes. Another intimate garment was the subligar, a form of loincloth similar in function to men's subligaculum. This provided modesty and protection for the lower body, creating a layer between skin and the tunic. Some artistic evidence, particularly mosaics showing female athletes, depicts women wearing what appear to be breastbands, and brief-like lower garments that resemble modern bikinis, though whether these athletic garments were worn in daily life or only for exercise and competition is debated. Over the undertunic, respectable married women wore the stola, a long dress-like garment that was the female equivalent of the toga in social significance. The stola extended from shoulders to feet, often dragging on the ground behind the wearer. The garment might be sleeveless or have short sleeves, with straps over the shoulders and a belt or cord worn just below the breasts, creating the characteristic high-waisted appearance of Roman women's dress. The stola was specifically a garment of married women, with unmarried women and those of lower status wearing only the long tunic, without the additional stola layer. The visual distinction between tunic-wearing and stola-wearing women immediately communicated marital status and respectability. Prostitutes and adulteresses were prohibited from wearing the stola, similar to how they were sometimes associated with male toga-wearing, marking them visually as outside respectable society. The fabric of the stola varied by wealth and occasion. Everyday stolae might be simple undyed wool or linen, practical garments for household management. For public appearances and social occasions, wealthier women wore stolae of finer fabrics in various colours, potentially with decorative elements like borders, embroidery, or applied gold thread. The quality and decoration of the stola communicated the wearer's economic status and taste. Over the stola, when going out in public or for additional formality, women wore the palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be draped in various ways. The palla served functions similar to male cloaks, providing warmth, protection from sun and rain, and an additional layer of modesty and formality. The draping of the palla allowed creative expression, with different arrangements creating different aesthetic effects. The palla could be worn simply across the shoulders and arms, hanging down the back. It could be pulled up over the head as a covering, creating a hooded effect that provided modesty and protection from elements. It could be wrapped around the body in more complex arrangements involving multiple layers and folds. The versatility allowed women to adjust their appearance and coverage according to situation, weather, and personal preference. The colours of women's clothing were more varied than men's garments. While white or light colours remained standard for respectability, women were permitted broader colour palettes than men. Bright colours like red, yellow, purple, and green appeared in women's stolae and pallae, with colour choices reflecting both personal taste and fashion trends. Richer, more saturated colours required expensive dyes, and therefore served as status markers. The decoration of women's clothing was more elaborate than men's. Embroidered borders, woven patterns, applied metal threads, and other decorative elements enhanced stolae and pallae for formal occasions. The decoration demonstrated both wealth and the skill of craftspeople who created the garments. Particularly elaborate garments might be treasured possessions passed through families or given as prestigious gifts. Women's dress was more extensively regulated by sumptuary laws and social conventions than men's clothing. Specific colours and fabrics were restricted to certain classes or prohibited in certain contexts. The purple associated with imperial power was strictly controlled, with unauthorised wearing of certain shades of purple by women being punishable. These regulations attempted to maintain visible social hierarchies and prevent lower status women from dressing above their station. The jewellery and accessories that complemented women's clothing were important elements of overall appearance. Rings, bracelets, necklaces, earrings, fibulae, decorative pins for fastening garments, and hair ornaments completed the dressed appearance. Wealthier women owned extensive jewellery collections in gold with precious stones, while poorer women made do with base metal ornaments or went without. The quantity and quality of jewellery was directly correlated with economic status. Hairstyling was another crucial component of women's appearance. Respectable women did not appear in public with unbound hair, which was associated with mourning, madness, or inappropriate sexuality. Instead, hair was dressed in elaborate styles that changed according to fashion. The most complex hairstyles required assistance from slave ornatresses, female slaves who specialised in hairdressing and cosmetics application. The time investment in achieving proper hairstyling could be considerable. Cosmetics were widely used by Roman women despite some moralistic criticism. Face powder, rouge, eye makeup, and other cosmetic preparations enhanced appearance, according to beauty standards emphasising pale skin, rosy cheeks, and defined eyes. The application of cosmetics was a morning ritual for many women, another task requiring time and often assistance from slaves. The use of cosmetics was accepted as normal grooming for respectable women, not limited to prostitutes or scandalous women as some modern misconceptions suggest. Footwear for women included sandals for warm weather and closed shoes for colder conditions. The footwear was similar in basic construction to men's, but was sometimes more delicate or decorative. Wealthier women owned multiple pairs in different styles and colours coordinated with different outfits. Poorer women might own only a single pair or go barefoot within their homes, reserving footwear for public appearances. The complete process of dressing for a wealthy Roman woman was time-consuming and often required assistance. Bathing, cosmetics application, hairdressing, donning multiple layers of undergarments and outer clothing, putting on jewellery and accessories, and arranging the Palla all took time and often needed help from one or more slave attendants. The morning preparation was a significant investment, preparing for public appearance. The physical experience of wearing multiple layers of clothing in Roman climate varied by season. In winter, the layers provided appreciated warmth, with women adding additional cloaks or wraps when needed. In summer, the multiple layers of fabric became uncomfortable, particularly the wool or heavier fabrics. The long stolae dragging on floors collected dirt and dust, requiring frequent cleaning or replacement of the most damaged bottom sections. The modesty expectations encoded in women's clothing were significantly more restrictive than for men. Women's bodies were to be covered from neck to feet in public, with only face, neck, and hands normally visible. This extensive coverage reflected cultural values emphasising female chastity and the protection of women's bodies from public male gaze. The clothing created physical barriers that reinforced social and sexual boundaries. The restriction on movement imposed by women's clothing was considerable. The long stolae impeded walking, requiring careful stepping to avoid tripping on the fabric. The multiple layers limited freedom of movement. The Palla required frequent adjustment to maintain proper draping. The overall effect was clothing that made women slower and less mobile than men, physically embodying the restricted social roles women occupied. Lower-class women's dress was necessarily simpler and more practical. Working women, slaves, and the poor couldn't afford or maintain the elaborate layered dress of wealthy women. They typically wore simpler tunics, perhaps with a basic palla or shawl, but without the expensive fabrics, elaborate decorations or multiple layers. Their clothing allowed more freedom of movement necessary for labour, while still maintaining basic modesty. Female slaves' clothing was the simplest, often consisting of a single basic tunic and perhaps a basic shawl or cloak. The quality would be the lowest grade of fabric, the construction simple, the appearance purely functional. Slaves might receive cast-off clothing from mistresses or owners, wearing garments that were too worn or damaged for continued use by the free, but still serviceable for slave use. Prostitutes' dress was distinctive and regulated. Required to wear the toga rather than stola, they were visually marked as outside respectable female society. They might also wear distinctive colours or accessories that advertised their profession. The clothing rules for prostitutes served both to protect respectable women by clearly distinguishing them from disreputable women, and to mark sexual availability in ways that facilitated the commercial sex trade. Understanding women's dress reveals a world where clothing more thoroughly defined and restricted female experience than male. Where men donned relatively simple tunics and occasionally formal togas, women navigated complex layering, extensive preparation rituals, strict modesty requirements, and movement restrictions. The clothing physically embodied the different social expectations and roles men and women occupied, making visible through fabric and form the gender hierarchy structuring Roman society. Women's dress also shows greater variety and individual expression than men's clothing within the bounds of respectability. While the basic garments were standard, the colours, fabrics, decorations, jewellery, and accessories allowed personal style and aesthetic preferences to shape appearance. Women's dress was both more constrained by modesty requirements and more open to decorative elaboration than men's clothing, creating a paradox of restriction and expression. The gendered nature of Roman dress extended beyond the garments themselves to encompass the entire process and meaning of dressing. For men, particularly toga wearing, dressing was about public performance of citizenship. For women, dressing was about maintaining respectability, displaying family wealth, and navigating the boundary between appropriate beauty enhancement and inappropriate sexual display. The clothing choices were never purely practical but always socially meaningful, communicating messages about identity, status, and values with every fold and fibre. The materials and colours of Roman clothing weren't merely aesthetic choices, but carried deep social meanings that communicated status, profession, occasion, and values. Understanding these symbolic dimensions reveals how thoroughly Roman society encoded information in clothing, and how Romans constantly engaged in visual reading and evaluation of others based on dress. Wool was the fundamental fabric of Roman clothing, accounting for the vast majority of garments across all social classes. Mediterranean sheep produced wool suitable for textile production, making this fibre accessible and relatively affordable throughout the Roman world. The quality of wool varied tremendously, however, from coarse fibres producing rough, scratchy fabric to fine fibres creating smooth, comfortable textiles. This quality spectrum mapped onto social hierarchy, with the wealthy wearing fine wool and the poor making do with coarse grades. The processing of wool after shearing involved multiple steps that affected final quality. Washing removed natural oils and dirt. Combing aligned fibres and removed shorter, inferior strands. Spinning created thread of varying thickness and evenness, with finer, more uniform thread producing better fabric. Weaving combined threads into cloth, with tighter, more regular weaves, indicating skilled craftsmanship, and creating superior textiles. Each step involved choices and skill levels that affected final quality and price. Linen, made from flax plants, was the second major fabric, preferred for its coolness and comfort, but more expensive than wool. Linen production required growing flax, harvesting it at the right time, retting to separate fibres, cleaning, combing, spinning, and weaving. The process was labour-intensive, and the resulting fabric was prized for its lightness, smooth texture, and ability to remain cool in hot weather. Linen garments indicated some wealth and sophistication beyond the bare minimum of wool. The finest linen came from Egypt, where Nile Valley conditions produced exceptional flax, and where centuries of expertise had refined production techniques. Egyptian linen was so fine that it was nearly transparent, creating gossamer fabric that was extremely expensive and luxurious. The very wealthy might wear tunics of fine Egyptian linen, enjoying comfort and displaying wealth simultaneously. This imported luxury fabric represented the high end of Roman textile economy. Silk was the ultimate luxury fabric, imported from China via the Silk Road trade routes at enormous expense. The exotic origin, the mysterious production process unknown to Romans, and the scarcity all contributed to silk's extreme cost. Only the very wealthy could afford silk garments, and silk clothing became associated with imperial power and the highest aristocracy. The use of silk was sometimes criticised as decadent and effeminate, yet it remained desirable for those who could afford it. Cotton was known to Romans but remained relatively rare and exotic, imported from India and other distant sources. It was less common than linen as a vegetable fibre fabric and more expensive than wool. Cotton's comfort and coolness were appreciated, but supply limitations prevented it from becoming a major fabric in Roman clothing. The occasional cotton garment indicated wealth and access to exotic trade goods. The dyeing of fabrics created the colour palette of Roman clothing. The natural colours of undyed wool and linen, ranging from cream to light grey and brown, were standard for ordinary people who couldn't afford dyeing expenses. Dyed fabrics required additional processing and materials, increasing cost proportionally to the rarity and expense of dyes used. Different dyes came from various sources and produced different colours at different price points. Madder roots produced reds, ranging from pink to deep red, depending on concentration and mordants used. Indigo from plants created blues. Weld produced yellows. Kermes insects yielded another type of red. Various plants, minerals and animal sources provided the palette Romans used for colouring textiles. The most expensive and prestigious colour was purple. Purple dye, particularly the deep shade called Tyrian purple, was extraordinarily expensive because it came from murex shellfish that had to be harvested in large quantities and processed to extract tiny amounts of dye. Thousands of shellfish were required to dye a single garment deep purple, making this colour so costly that it became legally restricted to imperial use. The emperor alone could wear garments entirely of Tyrian purple, with unauthorised use being treasonous. Lesser shades of purple, lighter or less saturated versions requiring less dye, were permitted to senators and other high officials in the form of stripes or borders on togas and tunics. These purple accents immediately identified the wearer's elevated status. The colour's expense ensured that it remained an effective status marker, as counterfeiting was prohibitively costly. Purple remained the preeminent status colour throughout Roman history. The colour of common citizens' clothing followed patterns determined by cost, practicality and convention. White or natural light colours were standard for formal and public contexts, suggesting cleanliness and respectability. Darker colours like brown, grey and dull greens were common for working clothing as they showed dirt less, and were produced using cheaper dyes. Bright colours in the middle price range, such as saturated reds, blues and yellows, indicated moderate wealth and appeared on clothing for special occasions. The symbolism of colours extended beyond status indication. White was associated with purity, cleanliness and religious contexts. Black or dark colours indicated mourning and grief. Red had associations with blood, military contexts and sometimes sexual availability when worn by women in certain configurations. The colour choices communicated messages that viewers read according to shared cultural codes. The combination of fabric quality, dye quality, and garment construction created hierarchy of clothing quality that was immediately visible and socially meaningful. A wealthy man's toga of fine white wool with a broad purple stripe immediately announced senatorial status. A poor man's tunic of coarse, undyed wool communicating poverty and low status was equally readable. The visual language of clothing allowed instant social evaluation that structured interactions and reinforced hierarchies. The maintenance of light-coloured clothing required constant effort and expense. White or cream garments showed every stain and required frequent cleaning to maintain acceptable appearance. The labour and cost of keeping clothing clean was substantial enough that pristine white garments themselves became status symbols, indicating resources to maintain high cleanliness standards. Wealthy Romans could afford frequent professional cleaning. Poor Romans had to make do with less frequent home washing. The relationship between clothing and occupation was also visually encoded. Certain professions had characteristic dress that identified practitioners. Prostitutes wore togas, as mentioned earlier. Philosophers affected simple, rough clothing, advertising their rejection of material concerns. Priests wore distinctive garments for religious ceremonies. Soldiers had military dress. The visual identification of occupation through dress facilitated social navigation and allowed quick classification of strangers. The used clothing market was substantial and socially significant. Clothing was expensive enough that used garments retained significant value. When wealthy people discarded clothing that was too worn or unfashionable for continued use, the garments entered secondary markets where poorer people purchased them. These hand-me-down clothes allowed poor Romans to dress better than their income would allow purchasing new. though the quality decline and visible wear marked the garments as cast-offs. The textile trade and clothing manufacture employed thousands throughout the Roman Empire. Shepherds raised sheep for wool, farmers grew flax for linen, textile workers cleaned, combed, spun, and wove fibres into fabric. Dyers coloured textiles, tailors and seamstresses constructed garments, fullers cleaned and finished clothing, merchants distributed fabric and finished garments. The clothing economy was substantial and employed people across the social and skill spectrum. The regulation of clothing through sumptuary laws attempted to maintain visible social boundaries and prevent status display by inappropriate groups. Laws specified which colours certain classes could wear, what fabrics were permitted to different ranks, and what decorations were appropriate for various statuses. While enforcement was imperfect and laws were sometimes evaded, the legal regulation of dress demonstrates how seriously Romans took clothing's social communication functions. The foreign fabrics and styles that entered Roman markets through trade and conquest created ongoing tensions between traditional Roman dress and exotic alternatives. Silk from China, cotton from India, and various foreign garment styles tempted Romans seeking novelty and luxury. Moralists criticised these foreign influences as corrupting traditional Roman virtue, but the flow of new fabrics and fashions continued regardless, reflecting Roman engagement with broader Mediterranean and Asian trade networks. Understanding the fabrics, colours, and social meanings of Roman clothing reveals a society where dress was never merely functional, but always communicative. Every garment choice, every colour selection, every quality decision communicated information about the wearer's identity, status, and values. Romans constantly engaged in visual evaluation of others based on clothing, reading the social messages encoded in fabric and colour, using dress as a primary tool for navigating the complex hierarchies and relationships structuring their society. The attention Romans paid to clothing, and the substantial resources they invested in it, reflect both practical necessity, as people needed protective covering, and social necessity, as proper dress was essential for maintaining position and reputation. The elaborate system of meanings, regulations, and conventions surrounding Roman clothing shows a civilization that understood dress as fundamental to social order and individual identity, where what one wore determined who one was in the eyes of society. Roman clothing wasn't static, but evolved significantly across the roughly 12 centuries from Rome's founding, traditionally dated to 753 BCE, through the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE. Understanding this evolution reveals changing technologies, shifting social values, and the transformation of Roman society from small Italian city-state to world empire to fragmented successor states. The clothing people wore both reflected and contributed to these larger historical changes. In the early Republic, Roman dress was simpler and more practical than it became in later periods. The toga itself was smaller and easier to wear, requiring less fabric and simpler draping. The basic woolen tunic was the standard garment for citizens engaging in daily activities, with the toga reserved for formal public occasions, but not yet the elaborate burden it would become. The dress of this period reflected a society of farmers and soldiers, practical people who valued function alongside tradition. As Rome expanded through the Mediterranean world and encountered Greek civilization, Greek influence affected Roman dress significantly. The Romans had complex attitudes toward Greek culture, simultaneously admiring Greek achievements while asserting their own superiority. In dress, this manifested in adopting some Greek elements while rejecting others. Greek-style clothing like the chlamys, a short cloak, appeared in Roman wardrobes while maintaining distinctively Roman garments like the toga. The late Republic saw increasing elaboration of Roman dress among the wealthy. As Roman conquest brought enormous wealth flooding into Italy, the aristocracy invested in more expensive fabrics, more elaborate decorations, and larger wardrobes. The toga grew in size and complexity, requiring more fabric and more careful draping. The distinction between rich and poor dress became more visible, as the wealthy literally wrapped themselves in more expensive materials. The sumptuary laws passed during the late Republic attempted to restrict excessive display and maintain visible social hierarchies. These laws regulated who could wear certain colours, particularly purple, and what fabrics different classes could use. The laws revealed both the increasing diversity and elaboration of Roman dress and conservative anxiety, about social boundaries being eroded through clothing choices. The laws were frequently evaded but continued being passed, showing ongoing tension between display desires and social regulation. The early empire under Augustus saw attempts to revive traditional Roman dress as part of broader efforts to restore traditional values after the civil wars. Augustus himself reportedly wore togas regularly and encouraged other citizens to do the same. He passed laws requiring toga wearing in the forum and at public events. These attempts to preserve traditional dress reflected Augustan ideology, emphasizing return to ancestral customs and Roman virtue. Despite Augustan efforts, the toga continued its evolution toward greater size and complexity through the early imperial period. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the toga had reached its maximum dimensions, requiring enormous amounts of fabric and elaborate draping. The garment had become so impractical that even its ceremonial and symbolic functions struggled to justify its burdens. Complaints about toga's discomfort became common in literature, yet the garment remained required for formal occasions. Women's dress also evolved across this period. The stola became more elaborate among wealthy women, with richer fabrics, more decoration, and more complex draping. The palla similarly grew in size and decorative elaboration. Hairstyles became increasingly elaborate, with complex constructions of curls, braids, and waves, requiring hours of work and considerable expertise. The overall trend was toward greater display and elaboration among those who could afford it. Military dress evolved significantly with military technology and organisation. Early Roman soldiers wore relatively simple military equipment, but as warfare became more sophisticated and professional, military clothing became more standardised and specialised. The introduction of mail armour, then scale armour, then plate armour, changed the protective layers soldiers wore. The military cloak and tunic also evolved in response to diverse campaign environments. The crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire faced military, political and economic challenges, affected civilian dress through economic constraints and social disruption. The elaborate dress of the High Empire became less sustainable as resources were diverted to military needs. Simpler, more practical clothing became standard out of necessity. The distinctions between civilian and military dress blurred as militarization affected society broadly. The late Empire saw dramatic transformations in Roman dress reflecting broader cultural and political changes. The toga declined significantly in use, with alternative garments like the pennula becoming more common even for formal occasions. The distinctive Roman dress codes gradually gave way to styles influenced by Germanic, Persian, and other foreign traditions as the empire became more diverse and its borders more porous. Christianity's rise affected dress in multiple ways. Early Christians often adopted simpler dress as statement of rejection of worldly luxury and display. Some Christian writers criticised elaborate clothing and jewellery as vain and sinful. Yet as Christianity became mainstream and eventually official, Christian elites adopted elaborate dress similar to pagan aristocrats, simply adjusting symbolism rather than abandoning display altogether. The late Roman military adopted elements of barbarian dress, particularly trousers and various foreign cloak styles, as Germanic peoples became increasingly important in military forces. This adoption spread to civilians, with trousers becoming more common and acceptable despite traditional Roman rejection of this garment. The practical advantages of trousers, particularly in cold climates, ultimately overcame cultural prejudices that had maintained their rejection for centuries. By the 5th century CE, distinctively Roman dress in traditional sense was largely gone. The toga had essentially disappeared from regular use, surviving only in very formal context and a symbolic garment representing governmental authority. The basic tunic remained but was worn with trousers, barbarian-style cloaks, and other elements that would have been unthinkable to earlier Romans. The clothing marked the end of classical Roman civilization and transition to early medieval European dress. The evolution of Roman dress across these centuries shows a dynamic system responding to changing circumstances. While maintaining certain core elements like the tunic and preserving toga as symbolic garment long after its practical obsolescence, Romans continuously adapted their dress to new technologies, new fabrics, new cultural influences, and new practical requirements. The clothing wasn't a fixed tradition rigidly maintained, but a living system that evolved with the society it clothed. The changes in dress both reflected and contributed to larger social transformations. The increasing elaboration of wealthy dress in the late Republic and early Empire reflected and displayed the growing wealth inequality in Roman society. The decline of the toga in late antiquity reflected the transformation of Roman identity and citizenship concepts as the empire fragmented. Clothing changes weren't merely superficial, but connected to fundamental social changes. Understanding this evolution reveals that asking what Romans wore under their togas must be specified chronologically. The answer differs significantly between 200 BCE and 200 CE, and again by 400 CE. The basic answer of tunics and loincloths remains constant, but the details, materials, styles, and social meanings all evolved. Roman dress was a moving target, changing across centuries just as Roman society itself continuously transformed. Beyond the social meanings and symbolic functions of Roman clothing, there were practical physical realities of wearing these garments daily that shaped the lived experience of ancient Romans. Understanding the discomforts, maintenance requirements, and daily practical challenges of Roman dress reveals the physical reality behind the idealized images, and provides important context for understanding ancient life. The physical sensation of wearing woolen clothing in Mediterranean climate was often uncomfortable. Wool's insulating properties, advantageous in winter, became disadvantageous in summer when the fabric trapped heat against the body. A woolen tunic or toga worn during a Roman summer day would become sweat-soaked, with the fabric growing heavy and sticky as it absorbed perspiration. The smell would become noticeable, particularly in crowded public spaces where many overheated wool-clad bodies gathered. The itchiness of wool varied by quality. Fine wool with smooth fibres was reasonably comfortable against skin. Coarse wool with rough fibres was scratchy and irritating, causing constant discomfort, particularly where fabric rubbed against skin at neck, armpits, and waist. Poor Romans wearing cheap coarse wool tunics endured this scratchy discomfort constantly, their clothing being a source of persistent irritation rather than comfort. The weight of clothing was significant, particularly when wearing multiple layers, including a toga. The physical burden of carrying 10 to 20 pounds of fabric draped around the body throughout the day caused fatigue. Shoulders bore most of the weight, with the toga's mass pressing down continuously. By evening, after hours of wearing a toga, the physical relief of removing it must have been substantial. The restriction of movement imposed by layered clothing, and particularly by togas, limited what Romans could do comfortably. Running was essentially impossible in a toga. Quick movements risked disrupting careful draping. Reaching or stretching required caution to avoid displacing fabric. The clothing itself made certain activities difficult or impossible, constraining the wearer physically and thereby influencing behaviour. The hygiene challenges of Roman clothing were substantial. Regular bathing was part of Roman culture, with public baths serving as daily social centres for many Romans. Yet clothing itself was more difficult to clean and was washed less frequently than bodies. A tunic worn daily might be washed weekly or even less frequently, meaning it accumulated sweat, dirt, and odours between washings. The Romans' daily bath cleaned their bodies but returned them to progressively dirtier clothing. The laundering process was harsh on fabrics. Whether done at home through soaking, scrubbing and beating, or commercially through treading in alkaline solutions and aggressive treatment, the cleaning process gradually destroyed the fabric. The choice between wearing dirty clothing and shortening garments' lifespan through frequent washing was a real dilemma. Most Romans chose to wash less frequently, tolerating dirtier clothes to preserve their limited wardrobes longer. The staining of light-coloured clothing was inevitable and difficult to remove. Sweat stains accumulated on tunics, particularly under arms and at collars. Food and drink stains occurred during meals. Dirt and mud from streets and floors marked lower portions of garments. These stains were visible on the white or light-coloured garments Romans wore for respectability, making cleanliness maintenance a constant challenge and making pristine white clothing a genuine status marker, indicating resources for frequent cleaning. The fabric damage that occurred through regular wear included not just overall degradation, but specific types of damage. Elbows and knees experienced concentrated wear from bending. Hems dragged on floors and streets, fraying and tearing. Seams strained under stress and sometimes split. Moths and other insects attacked wool, creating holes. The cumulative damage meant garments had finite lifespans determined by both wear frequency and storage conditions. The repair of clothing was constant necessity. Torn seams were resewn, holes were patched, frayed hems were trimmed and rehemmed. Patches appeared on garments, sometimes matching fabric and sometimes contrasting when matching material wasn't available. The visible patches and repairs on poor Romans' clothing immediately communicated economic status, showing inability to replace worn garments with new ones. The storage of clothing created challenges, particularly for wealthy households with extensive wardrobes. Garments needed protection from insects, particularly moths that destroyed wool, cedar chests, herbs like lavender, and other moth-repelling substances helped protect stored clothing. Regular airing of stored garments prevented musty odours and allowed inspection for insect damage. The labour of clothing storage and maintenance was considerable. The seasonal transition between wardrobes required substantial effort. As weather changed from cold to warm seasons or vice versa, appropriate clothing had to be retrieved from storage, inspected, repaired if needed, cleaned and prepared for use. The clothing no longer needed had to be cleaned before storage to prevent attracting insects to food stains and body oils, then properly stored with protective measures. Managing these transitions occupied time and labour. The physical discomfort of inappropriate clothing for conditions could be severe. Wearing heavy winter wool in summer heat could cause heat exhaustion, dehydration, and dangerous overheating. Wearing inadequate clothing in winter cold could cause hypothermia and frostbite. The Romans didn't have the variety of specialised clothing modern people use for different conditions, forcing them to endure discomfort or, in extreme cases, face health risks from inappropriate dress. The social pressure to maintain proper appearance despite these practical difficulties created psychological stress. A Roman had to present himself or herself properly dressed according to social expectations, yet maintaining that proper appearance required resources, labour, and constant attention that weren't always available. The anxiety about clothing being clean, undamaged, and appropriate was real and constant for those trying to maintain respectable status on limited means. The physical sensation of donning clothing each morning involved various textures and sensations. The linen or wool of undergarments against skin, the heavier wool of tunics settling onto shoulders, the weight of the toga being draped into position, the binding of belts at waist, the pressure of fastening pins, the enclosure of feet in shoes. All these physical sensations marked the transition from private nakedness to public clothed presentation. The daily adjustment of clothing was necessary and constant. Tunics rode up or twisted and needed pulling down and straightening. Togas slipped and needed repositioning. Belts loosened and required retightening. Shoes rubbed and needed adjusting. The clothing required active management throughout the day, with Romans frequently touching and adjusting their garments to maintain proper appearance and comfort. The physical relief of disrobing at day's end must have been considerable and eagerly anticipated. Removing the heavy toga, pulling off the sweat-soaked tunic, unwrapping the damp subligaculum, freeing feet from confining shoes, all these acts of undressing marked the transition from public social performance to private physical comfort. The naked or lightly clothed body freed from the day's clothing constraints could finally relax. The sleeping arrangements regarding clothing varied. Some Romans slept naked, enjoying complete freedom from clothing. Others slept in their subligaculum or a light sleeping tunic, maintaining minimal coverage for warmth or modesty. The wealthy might have special sleeping garments, simple tunics reserved for night use. The clothing worn for sleep was lighter and looser than day wear, allowing comfort during rest. Understanding these practical physical realities of Roman clothing reveals that the elegant draped garments shown in art and described in literature were lived experiences that were often uncomfortable, always requiring maintenance and frequently problematic. The Romans endured these discomforts because clothing served essential social functions that transcended physical comfort. Yet the discomfort was real and shaped daily experience in ways that modern people with comfortable, easily maintained clothing might struggle to fully appreciate. Modern representations of Roman dress, particularly in films, television, and popular imagination, diverge significantly from historical reality in ways that deserve correction. Understanding these misconceptions helps clarify what Romans actually wore while revealing how modern assumptions and theatrical necessities have created inaccurate but persistent images of ancient dress. The most pervasive misconception is that Romans routinely wore togas for daily activities. Films and television shows depict Romans walking around Rome in togas constantly, conducting business, socialising, and relaxing in this formal garment. The reality, as discussed extensively, was that togas were worn primarily for specific formal occasions, while most Romans spent most of their time in simple tunics. The visual dominance of the toga in modern media has created false impression that this was standard daily wear. This misconception partly stems from the toga's symbolic importance and its prominence in formal Roman art and sculpture. Statues and official portraits showed Romans in togas because this was formal dress appropriate for official representation. Artists didn't typically depict daily casual dress because it wasn't considered worthy of artistic representation. Modern people encountering these formal images assume they represent typical dress when they actually show special occasion clothing. Another misconception involves the cleanliness and brightness of Roman clothing. Modern media often shows Romans in pristinely white, perfectly clean togas and tunics that look freshly laundered. The reality was that Roman clothing, particularly after being worn throughout a hot day, would be sweat-stained, dusty, and dingy. The brilliant white that modern viewers expect would have been impossible to maintain without frequent professional cleaning that only the wealthy could afford. Most Romans' clothing was visibly dirty most of the time. The body types and physical appearance of Romans in modern media also diverge from ancient reality. Actors cast in Roman roles are typically physically attractive by modern standards, with muscular physiques, clear skin, and perfect teeth. Ancient Romans, even wealthy ones, wouldn't have possessed modern standards of physical attractiveness. They would show effects of less sophisticated dental care, different diet, harder physical labour, disease scars, and various physical imperfections that modern actors don't display. The colours of Roman clothing in modern media are often too vibrant and varied. While wealthy Romans did wear dyed fabrics in various colours, the dyes were more subdued than modern synthetic dyes produce. The brilliant electric blues, vivid purples, and intense reds shown in films would have been impossible with natural dyes used in antiquity. The actual colour palette was more muted, with less saturated colours and more limited range. The comfort level that modern actors display wearing their Roman costumes suggests these garments are more comfortable than ancient reality. Actors move easily in their toga costumes, gesturing freely and moving naturally. As discussed, actual togas were restrictive, heavy, and required constant attention to maintain proper draping. The ease with which characters in films wear togas creates false impression that these were comfortable practical garments rather than burdensome formal wear. The underwear question is often ignored or handled anachronistically in modern media. Films either don't address what's under tunics, or sometimes show anachronistic modern underwear if clothing shifts or scenes require it. The simple loincloth that was actual Roman undergarment appears rarely, perhaps because it seems too minimal or primitive for modern audiences expecting more substantial underwear. The social class indicators encoded in clothing are often oversimplified or ignored in modern media. Films might show obvious visual distinctions between very wealthy and very poor, but miss the subtle gradations of quality, fabric, decoration, and condition that Romans would have read immediately. The complexity of Roman clothing's social language is flattened into simple, rich versus poor dichotomy that loses the nuance of actual ancient social hierarchy. The gendered nature of Roman dress is sometimes mishandled, with modern concerns about gender equality creating representations where women move more freely and dress more practically than historical women actually did. While this makes more appealing entertainment, it obscures the restrictions that actual Roman women faced through their clothing. The physical and social constraints that women's dress imposed were significant and shouldn't be minimised in the name of modern sensibilities. The regional and seasonal variations in Roman dress are typically ignored in modern media, which tends to show a single Roman look regardless of setting. Films set in Britain show the same clothing as those set in Egypt, ignoring the climate-driven adaptations Romans actually made. The diversity of Roman dress across the empire's geographic extent is lost in favour of a standardised vision that emphasises Roman cultural unity at expense of historical accuracy. The evolution of Roman dress across centuries is similarly overlooked, with modern media often presenting a timeless Roman style that actually combines elements from different periods. A film set in Republican Rome might show clothing styles from the early empire or vice versa. The changes in dress across the roughly 1,000 years of Roman history are compressed into a single image representing no specific period accurately. The practical difficulties of Roman dress are minimised or ignored. Characters in films don't sweat through their clothing, don't struggle with togas slipping out of position, don't show the physical fatigue of wearing heavy garments, and don't display the visible dirt and staining that actual Roman clothing would accumulate. The sanitised, comfortable clothing of modern media bears little resemblance to the often uncomfortable reality of ancient dress. The modern additions and modifications made to ancient-style costumes for practical theatrical reasons create further inaccuracies. Costumes for films and shows are designed to be easy to put on and take off, comfortable for actors wearing them for hours, and able to withstand repeated use and cleaning. These practical requirements lead to construction methods and materials very different from ancient garments. The resulting costumes may look approximately Roman, but function very differently than actual ancient clothing. Some misconceptions arise from earlier eras' misunderstandings that have become traditional in depiction of Romans. The Victorian-era romantic vision of ancient Rome, with idealised classical figures in perfectly draped garments moving through spotlessly clean marble cities, has influenced subsequent depictions despite being thoroughly unrealistic. These layered misunderstandings, with each generation of artists building on previous generations' errors, have created imagery increasingly distant from historical reality. The purpose of correcting these misconceptions isn't to criticise modern entertainment, which must balance historical accuracy against narrative needs and audience expectations, but rather to clarify what Romans actually wore and experienced. Understanding the difference between entertaining fiction and historical reality allows appreciation of both without confusing them. The films are enjoyable as films, the history is fascinating as history. Neither needs to be identical to the other to have value. As the sun sets over the ancient world and the last toga is carefully folded away by a slave attending his master's evening disrobing, reflection on Roman dress reveals a system of clothing that was simultaneously practical and impractical, comfortable and uncomfortable, simple and complex. The garments Romans wore shaped their daily physical experience, while encoding social meanings that structured their society. Understanding what they wore and why illuminates both the material reality and the cultural values of this remarkable civilization. The basic answer to what Romans wore under their togas, the simple layers of subligaculum and tunic, seems almost anticlimactic after extensive exploration, yet the simplicity of the answer obscures the complexity of the reality. Those simple layers were made from specific fabrics available through particular production processes. They were constructed using techniques passed through generations. They were worn according to conventions encoding elaborate social meanings. They created physical sensations and practical challenges that shaped daily experience. The simple garments were windows into a complex world. The toga itself, Rome's most famous garment, emerges from this examination as a burden Romans bore for symbolic reasons despite practical disadvantages. The garment's fame in modern imagination is both justified by its genuine importance to Roman identity and misleading in suggesting it was typical daily wear. The toga represented something essential about how Romans understood themselves, while simultaneously being something most Romans avoided wearing when possible. This contradiction between symbolic importance and practical avoidance characterised Roman relationship with their most distinctive garment. The gender divide in Roman dress reflected and enforced broader social hierarchies that structured ancient life. Men's and women's clothing followed different patterns, imposed different restrictions, and communicated different social meanings. The clothing literally embodied the gender hierarchy, making visible through fabric and form the different roles, expectations, and constraints men and women navigated. Understanding the clothing reveals the lived experience of gender inequality in ways that abstract discussions of social structure cannot. The social meanings encoded in clothing, from fabric quality to colour choices to garment types, show how thoroughly Romans used dress as communication medium. Every clothing choice communicated status, occupation, wealth, respectability, and values. Romans constantly engaged in visual evaluation of others based on dress, reading the social messages while being aware that their own clothing was similarly being read. The clothing was never merely functional, but always socially meaningful, a constant performance of identity and status. The regional and temporal variations in Roman dress reveal a system that was both fixed and flexible. Certain core elements like the tunic remained constant across the empire and across centuries. Yet within this continuity there was substantial variation as Romans adapted their dress to different climates, incorporated foreign influences, and responded to changing technologies and values. The clothing system's flexibility allowed it to serve diverse populations in diverse environments while maintaining recognisably Roman character. The practical discomforts of Roman dress, from the weight of togas to the scratchiness of coarse wool to the constant need for adjustment and maintenance, reveal that ancient life involved accepting discomforts modern people would find intolerable. Romans endured uncomfortable clothing because they lacked alternatives and because social requirements outweighed physical comfort. The daily experience of wearing these garments shaped Roman bodies and behaviour in ways modern people with comfortable clothing might struggle to fully appreciate. The economic dimensions of clothing, from the textile production employing thousands, to the social differentiation based on garment quality, to the used clothing markets extending garment life cycles, show that dress was deeply embedded in Roman economic and social structures. Clothing represented a significant portion of household expenses and investment. The differences between rich and poor were materially embodied in what they wore, making economic inequality visible and visceral. The misconceptions in modern popular culture's depiction of Roman dress, while understandable given entertainment's different purposes than historical accuracy, have created persistent false images that shape modern understanding. Correcting these misconceptions restores a more accurate picture of ancient reality, while revealing how modern assumptions and biases influence our reception of the past. The sanitized, comfortable, always perfectly draped Romans of films never existed. The actual Romans were sweatier, scruffier, and less comfortable. The evolution of Roman dress across centuries, from the simpler practical garments of early Rome to the elaborate costly dress of the High Empire, to the transformed clothing of late antiquity, parallels and reflects broader social transformations. The clothing changes weren't superficial, but connected to fundamental shifts in Roman society, economy, values, and identity. Studying dress provides lens for understanding these larger changes in accessible, material ways. The ultimate revelation from examining Roman dress is that clothing was central to Roman life in ways modern people might not immediately recognize. For Romans, proper dress was essential to social identity, economic status, and civic participation. What one wore determined how one was perceived and treated. Maintaining appropriate clothing required substantial resources, labour, and attention. The clothing shaped physical experience, social interaction, and cultural identity. Modern people, accustomed to comfortable, easily maintained, relatively inexpensive clothing that we often take for granted, might struggle to fully appreciate how different Roman clothing experience was. The weight, the heat, the restrictions, the maintenance demands, the social meanings, all these created a relationship with clothing more intense and consequential than most modern people experience. Clothing mattered more to Romans than it matters to us, both practically and socially. Yet despite the differences, there are continuities. Humans across time have used clothing not just for protection, but for communication, for identity expression, for social positioning. The specific meanings differ across cultures and eras, but the basic human practice of using dress to signal and shape social relationships persists. Romans, like us, cared about how they looked, worried about having appropriate clothing, and used dress as a tool for navigating social worlds. Understanding what Romans wore under their togas, and over them, and around them, and on their feet and on their heads, provides insight into daily ancient life in its material, physical, social, and cultural dimensions. The clothing reveals the people who wore it, shows the society that produced and regulated it, and illuminates the values, anxieties, and priorities of a civilization distant in time, but whose material remains and cultural legacy continue shaping our world. The journey beneath the toga's folds has revealed multiple layers, literal and metaphorical. The sublegaculum, the tunic, the toga itself, the stola and palla, the fabrics and colours, the regional variations and historical changes, the practical realities and social meanings. All these layers combine to create a complex picture of Roman dress. The simple answer to what was under the toga, a tunic and loincloth, is accurate but incomplete without understanding all these dimensions. As darkness falls completely over the ancient world, as the last Roman carefully arranges tomorrow's tunic, and perhaps, for some formal occasion, prepares the toga that will need to be draped in the morning, the understanding remains. Roman dress was simultaneously simple in its basic components, and complex in its execution, meanings, and effects. It was practical clothing that people needed, an elaborate social system that structured interactions. It was material culture and symbolic communication. And beneath the famous toga, under all the layers and meanings, were simply human bodies trying to be appropriately dressed for the social worlds they inhabited, much like humans across time and space, different in details but similar in fundamental purpose.